proceedings on to Chris. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all enjoying the nice new spring weather. And thanks for those who've hung in there through this journey, which is of what is quite a complicated space. So just to, as I did before, I just want to spend a little bit of time, maybe 10 minutes, to look to see if anybody has any questions about last week's actual session on carbon accounting, or the week before, or anything else you've been thinking about relative to this area. Please either switch on your video and microphone and ask verbally, or put your questions into the chat. I will again have a little bit of question time in midway through, and I'm hoping to leave a reasonable amount of time at the end for people to ask questions about about this session today. And this session is kind of the pointy end of having counted where you are and knowing what your emissions are. How do you go about a strategy to reduce those emissions, and what do you say about it? What can you say and what can't you say when you're trying to communicate this to the people that matter, because that's why you're doing it. So any questions today from last week? I'd be very surprised if there weren't, considering the complex area of scope 3, for example. As I've mentioned before, this is your chance to get advice from someone who does this stuff all the time. Can everybody see my slides? No questions? Don't be bashful, people. Can't see anybody either. So no questions?
Nothing showing up.
Okay. All right, so then I'll move on to the pointy end of what we've been doing. So having seen what the drivers are in session 1, and I'll talk a bit more about some new drivers which appeared last week, and thinking about what do those drivers mean for SMEs. And even though there's things like new reporting legislation, which is mandatory, which affects big businesses, big and medium businesses, does that really mean anything for us? And the answer is yes, because some of us are in supply chains for them. But the whole environment has shifted, as we talked about. So understanding what the drivers are, including for small business and SMEs, and then last week, which is why the numbers of attendees might have dropped off, we looked at the very detailed area of how you count the carbon. How do I know where I am before I know how to reduce and get to where I'm going? And the main takeaway I wanted you to take from that was that now counting of carbon, which then becomes accounting of carbon when you multiply that by some financial impact, is as rigorous as your tax. So it's carbon counting and carbon accounting has become viewed and is seen as, and needs to be, as accurate and reliable and independently assessed, or should, in the same way as any other financial information. And even if that's, again, you don't need to do that for your own business, you don't get your books done or anything like that. If you provide information to somebody else, either the public or to other businesses for whom you're a supplier, then they will expect that information, that counting and accounting, to be at the same level, as they need to do it, and to be independently verified and assured. So keep that in mind. There are a number of ways to do that. You can do it yourself on a spreadsheet, just like you can do your tax on a spreadsheet if you're fairly small. You can outsource it to a consultant who will do that on your behalf. And just like in the tax world, there are various tax packages that you can get. There are various carbon accounting packages, or carbon counting packages, and now increasingly carbon accounting packages, which enable you to count that. But the whole purpose of counting this is to understand where we are and what the risks are in terms of the rapidly decarbonising world. And we'll see a bit more about what that means, about what Australia's doing about that in a little minute. But in the end, that gives us the risks and what the opportunities are. It doesn't tell us how to capitalise on that. And if we've got risk, how to reduce that by reducing our emissions. So what I want to look at this third session is strategy development and communication. You can't manage what you don't manage. So we're going to look today at how we set up and go about developing a strategy to get our emissions down or offset, and in some of the pitfalls about that, and then the quite strict rules around what we can and can't. And there'll be quite a few surprises in there for some people today, I think, about as we go through that. So here's the agenda for today. As I said, we had our Q&A time. Everybody's full bottle. They have no questions, so I'm going to move on. In part one, I'll look at strategy, particularly the main part of strategy development, developing a comprehensive decarbonisation strategy. For those of you who want to go to carbon neutral, which is one of the popular ways that SMEs like to announce to the world, because it's formally accredited by the government, what that carbon neutral certification looks like. I'll talk about some of the questions around that now. And then we'll talk about the new world of net zero and what that looks like and whether you should go that way. And then I'll have a question time around that, because that's quite a complex space and people might have some questions. And then after the question time, where you can also whip out get a quick coffee if you want, we won't be offended. I'll look in the second part about some of the nitty-gritty bits of that, because for SMEs, there's not a lot you can do. So I'll look at this whole area of renewable energy generation, and STCs, and also carbon offsets and Australian carbon credit units, because if you can't reduce, you can get to carbon neutral by offsetting. Then I'll look at communication and how you can communicate, what you should communicate and how you can communicate it, and particularly publicly advertising decarbonisation claims, because there are strict rules around that, and there's a big push against greenwashing, which is saying something you're not actually doing. And so you can't just put announcements out there anymore and advertise things as being carbon neutral or net zero or whatever, without falling foul of the Australian Consumer Competition and Consumer Corporation and consumer law. I've said 15 minutes for questions at the end. If we finish the knowledge part and the learning part early, I'm happy to take longer questions. Personally, I'm happy to hang on for a little bit longer after 12 o'clock as well, if there are any questions, because this is the last time you have to get the questions that you have answered. And then, of course, I've got a little thing for you to take away and think about when we leave the session. Okay. This is the big news from last week for those of you who are not under a rock, living under a rock, and have seen this announcement. There were two things that came out, actually. I haven't shown the other one. The other one was a quite scary report about what happens if we don't stay below 1.5 degrees, and the likely implications of at 2 degrees and above for Australia. And it was pretty grim reading, including for Western Australia. And so and what that was basically saying was that we haven't done enough. And if we don't do enough, we're going to get above 2 degrees, in fact, probably go to 3 or 4 degrees. And there are significant implications for us physically and, of course, then economically. And so we need to get on with it. That is, again, a scientific report. It's not government policy or government thought bubble. That is independently peer-reviewed, scientifically produced evidence, scientifically produced modeling. And so what you see there is, in fact, probably even a little bit conservative. So that told us that in fact, it told us not only that we have to start to reduce again more seriously globally, and I want to come back to that in a minute, but also that even we need to start building in the implications of actual physical climate change, which is already happening. And a good example of that is that your insurance will go up. That's one of the things you'll see very quickly, that because the insurers bear the brunt of these impacts, that your insurance will go up. Even some of the hidden sleepers in there about the fact that they're going to be increasing heat-related deaths. And again, if you have employees and you put them out in a position where they are impaired or injured or sadly killed due to heat stress or heat stroke, then you become liable for that. So there are a whole bunch of implications around that. There's increased deterioration and depreciation of assets, capital and otherwise. So a whole bunch of things that we need to watch out for. In some places, floods. In some places, bushfires. So that was the first thing that came out last week, which preceded this. So I would encourage you to read that climate change impact report and think about what the implications might be for your families, for the city, for the state, and for your business. But the other thing that came out was shortly after that, on September the 18th, was that the Australian government announced that it had new emissions cuts targets for 2035. So we already know that they were going to reduce by 42% against 2005 by 2030. As we saw, we were only at the beginning of the course 224 weeks away from that. We'll do an update on that in a minute. But so now they're starting to think about the longer term, the next 5 years after that, which is by 2035. And so what they announced was that the government target, which I think they will legislate the same as they did for the 2030 target, was to cut emissions between 62 and 70% by 2035 against 2005 numbers. So they're upping the ambition by another 20 to 25%, 20 to 25% in the following years after that. So in the 240 odd, 260 weeks after 2030, they're aiming again for another 20% reduction. A further 20 to 25% reduction against their 2030 number, assuming they hit their 2030 number. If not, they've got a bigger job. So that's, again, has driver implications. It also, as you'll see from the Channel 9 news, who like to give you some good news as well, that there is a bunch of new money which they're going to put towards this. And so that's the opportunity for you as SMEs in small business to get your hands on some of that. And we'll talk about that in a moment. The other thing that happened at the same time was that, as we see from Reuters, that despite what seemed like quite ambitious targets and have caused a great deal of upset on some sides of the political spectrum as being doom and gloom, that those emissions in fact are not enough. And some environmentalists and some people see them as not being enough even for us. And so there's been a bit of backlash. There's been backlash that it's too much, and there's been backlash that it's not enough, as is usual in this situation. But that's the big news as of now. So whatever the drivers were before this, there's now an increased driver post 2030. So this is not going to go away anytime soon. Okay. So what are the objectives of this session? I'll look at the new targets and what they mean. We'll develop a new strategy. We'll look at carbon neutral certification and the other things that I mentioned we'll do before. So how does the government propose to get to that target, that additional an additional 22 to 25% between 2030 and 2035. So according to them, they're going to increase the clean energy across the economy, so more renewable electricity generation by new transmission and storage, and including household batteries. We already know they're rolling out a whole bunch of household batteries now. Small businesses can also get batteries, they just don't get a subsidy. So you might find, it's not, I don't know this for sure, this is just my speculation, but you might find that there might be a small business subsidy come out as well for small businesses who own their own premises, for SMEs. So a big push on electricity, and that's not just for the normal uses of electricity for stationary purposes, but it's also, of course, because another part of this is an increased switch to EVs and vehicle efficiency standards. So for the light vehicle, general small vehicle market, the expectation is that by 2035, 50% of all new vehicles would be EVs or higher. Also, what we'll increasingly see, and you're going to see it now, is small trucks are also quickly going electric. We'll see that by 2035, most of the large fleet will be transitioning, even large trucks will be transitioning to electricity, to EVs, electrical, and we're starting to even see now heavy plant and equipment going in place in mining sites and construction, and you can do it in construction sites, which are electric as well. So this is most of these gains over that period are to increase the renewable energy electricity component in the grid, to decarbonize it, to switch coal off entirely in that period, have some gas, and to switch to renewables, and then to electrify everything. So even within households, you can start to see ovens and stoves and other things in small businesses, and even in industrial, some small manufacturing places replacing coal or gas or diesel fuel with electricity. And so you'll see an increasing effort around that. You'll see increasing, as I said, transition to electric vehicles. And this is a bit that are kind of important to you two, the first two, because around how you do your business, but also how you transport the stuff you make around will be a key part of this. They're going to expand clean fuel use because some of the big equipment still needs biodiesel, and it's not easy to electrify them. So there'll be a big push around biodiesel and the so-called clean fuel use and low carbon liquid fuels, and also support being put into green hydrogen. They're going to accelerate new technologies through this future made in Australia investment and to bring manufacturing of some of these things onshore. And the last one is quite important as well, and it's relevant to some of you, but it's a big opportunity for the agricultural sector and for others, to enable landholders to earn money for eligible carbon storage and to make sure there's a robust ACCU scheme in place, the Australian carbon credit unit scheme. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on as well, to make sure that's robust, and because it's had some issues recently, so that there's incentive for people to do more carbon removals and carbon storage in lots of different forms. So these are the big changes you can see after 4.5 years from now. So we're already for the 5 years after the following 4.5 years. And you might think that's a long way off, but it's not very far. So you start to think about those things as well, both in terms of risks, but more importantly, I think, in terms of opportunities for you guys. All right. What we're all interested in as part of this is show me the additional money. So as we pointed out, and as Channel 9 said, the government is putting significant amounts of funds towards this. Some people will say not enough money, and some people will say too much money, depending on which side of the political spectrum you sit on or your personal views. In addition to help to meet the target, the Albanese government said they will deliver a new $5 billion net zero fund in the National Reconstruction Fund to help industrial facilities decarbonise, scale up more renewables and low emissions manufacturing. So if you're in those areas, if you're in manufacturing, or you supply to industrial facilities or your own industrial facility, then there's $5 billion on top of the existing money that's in there, and there's a lot of money in that one already, to help you to do that transition. So you can reach out to them. There'll be $2 billion for the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to drive downward pressure on electricity prices. So, for example, this is where medium to large businesses can get capital for doing energy efficiency projects, again for decarbonisation, to do that switch to take it from fossil fuel powered machinery across to diesel. So that's basically a low interest capital fund which doesn't have the same strict requirements as the big banks. There'll be $1 billion to encourage more production of clean fuels in Australia, and that'll be an opportunity for small scale businesses as well, particularly around food waste and waste food oils and various other smaller scale opportunities to produce clean fuels. There'll be money to encourage that at large scale, and I think at smaller scale. 40 million to accelerate the rollout of curbside and fast EV charging across suburbs and regions. So again, if you're wanting to take your fleet, either your own company vehicle, if you're a service provider who runs around in a vehicle, or to take your transport, if you have your own transport, to EV, you can get help for that as well. With the existing, you can expect the existing incentives for that to remain, but you'll find many more EV and particularly fast EV charging stations in the suburbs and around the country. Here's the big news for you guys. 85 million for frameworks and tools to help households and businesses understand and improve their energy performance. So you can expect a lot of, they're going to put a lot of money into providing you with information and tools and ways to help you to understand how you can improve your energy performance, and therefore by improving your energy performance, reduce both your electricity costs, because we know the price of that's going up because of the underlying carbon price on that, but also to reduce your emissions, because the grid still won't be entirely decarbonised until, by the look of it, after 2035. So there's a good source of money for you to help you to to reduce your energy performance, and that'll come through in that period. And for those of you who are in sports, of course, the government has to act, I say this very carefully, if this is a way of reaching a large amount of the Australian public to show the government's serious. There'll be 50 million for sports clubs to enable them to also decarbonise and drive climate action. All right. So, and if you think about that, for sports clubs, a large bit of that is around facilities. And who looks after the facilities? The local governments do. So there's a bit of a wake-up call here for local government, because they will, the sports clubs that sit within your facilities will want to decarbonise, but there might be an opportunity for local governments also to access, I don't know the rules yet, to access this fund to assist those sports clubs to decarbonise as well. So you change the air conditioners to more efficient ones, change their gas powered or their gas powered ovens and stoves and hot water systems across to and their vehicles. So a lot of money, good opportunity coming after 2030. But I'll also remind you there are a number of incentives and opportunities already in place, and you can go and see what they are. Just to reiterate that the global shift to clean energy represents one of the biggest economic transformations since the Industrial Revolution, and not to dwell on the risk, but also to understand that there's an enormous economic and jobs opportunities here in this transition. Yes, there's pain, and yes, it will cost us more, but the long-term economic benefit outweighs that, and what people need to think about, and you guys need to think about, is where are the opportunities for this, and where are the job opportunities as well in this transition. So with all of this going on, where's my mouse? So that all sounds very good, but let's just step back a little bit and think whether our friends, the environmentalists who were not happy about this, what this really means, and are we going far enough? And is this really the big deal that the Australian government has said? It's fantastic, by the way. I think it's a great step forward, but let's see whether it's really enough. So if you remember at the beginning of the course, we had 224 weeks to meet our 2030 target, and now we're talking about a 2035 one. Now, 2 weeks later, we've got about 222 weeks. This is a global number. So the other thing I want to talk about also is that it's all right for Australia to decarbonise at that rate, and we should, because it provides us with opportunities, and we need to be leaders in this space as well. But if we do so simply by shifting emissions offshore, it doesn't really help, because this is a global thing that has to happen. And so the government's also, if you remember, talking about a 2005 emissions reduction. So on our little graph here, if you can see my cursor, if you look at on the left-hand side where the gigatons of CO2 is, if we go back to around about 2005, what do you notice? They've set their target against 2005, which was when the emissions were much lower than they are now. So we've actually continued to increase by now. So a 62% emissions reduction against 2005 numbers is actually less than it looks. Because according to the science, as we saw from the modeling, we had to have a 50% reduction against the 2017 numbers, which were already 10% higher than 2005. And in fact, because we haven't stopped, we haven't peaked at that time, and in 2025, they're still even higher, somewhere a bit more up here by 2025, then in fact, the emissions that the government have committed to are in fact lower than what the science says we have to do globally. So yes, all credit to them, good on them, that they're having a good crack. They've set an ambitious target, which is higher than we would expect from some other people and higher than some other countries around the place. But according to the science, even that target is not enough. But it's a good target to have. So what it's also telling us is that in the next 4.5 years, we still need a reduction. We've got a 50% reduction, a 42% reduction, but then we need to do about twice that in the following 5 years after that to get to that 60 to 72% against the 2005 number. What we'll find is by 2030, in the next, when the major COP meeting, international meeting in 2030, that climate change actually seems to be moving faster, that the emissions targets we've set are not enough, and there'll be even more push, particularly from the financial sector that we talked about, to go faster. So yes, great target, a lot of work to do. There's some doubt that we can even meet this anyway, even that target, but let's go for this. Let's give it our best crack. So I just want to kind of insert this view. And the other thing, of course, is it's all right for us to decarbonize, but if we do that by shifting heavier emitting industries offshore, or we don't, and the government doesn't talk anywhere about this, about supply chain. If we continue to import goods, scope 3 emissions from the rest of the world and they've not decarbonised, then we miss this target as well. So what was missing from the government's plan is they're focused on Australia, but they didn't talk about our role as a buyer of goods to try and decarbonise the scope 3s. So this is only scope 1 and 2 for Australia. They didn't talk about scope 3, and in fact, that's the one that's going to be it's all right for us to go fast, and that's good for our economy, lots of opportunities, provides jobs and economic growth for us and economic benefit, but it doesn't help the planet as much as if the rest of the world moves. So just keep those in mind in light of the excitement that's going around at the moment. Okay, so I just want to jump back. I talked about this in session 1, but because we're going to talk about strategy, I'm going to talk about it again now. So we need to go back and think about if we're going to set some kind of target and we're going to go down a reductions path in line with the government's path, or because we want to show that we are really serious about this and people should buy our products because we're ahead of our competitors, then we need to think about what sort of target or what sort of label we're going to put on this. So are we going to go carbon neutral, or are we going to talk about net zero's emissions? What's in a name anyway? Can't we just use them interchangeably? And why does it matter? There is actually a difference between carbon neutral and net zero emissions. And increasingly, there's a shift from carbon neutral as being the kind of leading standard or where people should be saying they are, to net zero emissions. And that's on a couple of grounds. And I'll talk about that more about when I talk about this climate active scheme. But because people have been going carbon neutral without reducing their own emissions as much and buying a lot of offsets, it's kind of tarnished the people's view of carbon neutral. And people are saying, actually, we need to have a way of showing that people are actually doing reductions, getting on with doing something about reducing emissions, not just buying their way out of it. The second thing is to also the science and all the economic modeling, particularly with scope 3, has injected a sense of realism and practicality into this, in that the only way we could go carbon neutral is a lot of offsets, whereas it's better to actually show that we are having some kind of pathway which shows that we're on a pathway to reducing emissions till they're at net zero, in other words, 90% reduction by our target, and focus our people's attention on that and not on buying offsets to buy our way out. So just to keep in mind for you who are considering what you should say about your journey, for your stakeholders and for your marketing, the new view and the one that's recommended is to have a net zero target and a net zero pathway, rather than as the first step. And then on top of that, if you want to show that you're ahead, you're even more committed, then say that in addition to being on that pathway, reducing as much and as fast as we can, we will also go carbon neutral, and we will purchase offsets, because that encourages other people to reduce faster than they would have. But you need to be a bit careful with those offsets, and I'll talk about those towards the end of the strategy. So what's the difference between in carbon neutral? There's just a minimum requirement of covering scope 1 and 2, with encouragement to do scope 3 and net zero. If you make a commitment to net zero, you need to be very clear whether it's just scope 1 and 2 or it is scope 3. And to be on a true net zero path, you need to also be reducing your scope 3 emissions. And we all know what that is from last week, which is your supply chain upstream and your upstream supply chain, but also keep in mind that you need to reduce your products emissions because you're in the value chain. So you need to talk about that. As I said, Australia's not talking about that in their targets. They're just setting decarbonisation strategies for scope 1 and 2, not really talking about how we should be tackling the emissions that are coming from offshore. or the supply chain. Level of ambition, there's no ambition under carbon neutral, despite the words that they say, to reduce the emissions on a certain trajectory to be carbon neutral. And as a result of that, there's a number of large companies have pulled out of the Climate Active program, which is the Australian one, which I'll talk about in a minute, because it's been quite evident that companies haven't been reducing, they've just been buying a lot of offsets and claiming carbon neutral. And so the whole, as I said, the concept of carbon neutral has been tarnished a little bit of late, but also particularly the Climate Active certification from the Australian government has lost its reputation a little bit. And so there'll need to be some work around that. You can get around that. You can still go carbon neutral to show that you're really committed, but you should also underpin that by showing that you're on a net zero pathway and that you've reduced as much of your emissions as you can, and then you've gone to offsets. But you can't claim that you are at net zero until you've reduced both your scope 1 and 2 and 3, all of your scope 1, 2, and 3 by 90%, and then only using 10% of offsets. But you can say you're on a pathway to net zero, and that's what I'm recommending for you guys, that if you're going to go to make any kind of target or any kind of strategy, that you actually say that you set forth on a net zero pathway, on a pathway to reach a scientific pathway to reach net zero by the time you reach your target. You've set your target, and you claim that you're on the scientific pathway to net zero. But you can also then go further than that and say, and what's more, we are actually going to go carbon neutral for the remaining emissions that we can't reduce at the moment. According to that pathway, we will then offset. So it's really important that you think through that difference, and that you make that very clear and think about that as you're going. The other thing about this is that for those residual emissions by 2050, but if you're going carbon neutral, then really what you need to do is purchase carbon offsets that either result in carbon under carbon neutral. You can use either reductions emissions or removals emissions. So reductions emissions are those that reduce existing emissions. Other people reduce existing emissions to less than they were. Removals ones are where we actually take carbon out of the air, and they're the only ones that count in the end. And so if you're going to go carbon neutral, you should use removals ones and not reductions ones. So I just want to set that basis. So when we're talking about net zero, okay, so if you're going to do your strategy, then this is the diagram that's best to help you. All right, this is a step-by-step process for the whole decarbonisation strategy process. So this is the one I suggest that you use. You start at the top, so you look at the international, national business environment drivers, and that's why I started this course with that. Understand what they are, understand your place in them, understand your risks and opportunities, understand what your stakeholders want, because that then determines the rest of it. What sort of strategy should I use? Carbon neutral, net zero? What sort of targets and timeframes should I set? What are the ways in which I should reduce? What are my opportunities? If I'm going to do this, what's the government going to help me with money to do? Where am I going to get government support? Understand the whole environment, and we talked about a lot today. We'll talk about that today, and we've talked about it already. So understand the environment, and my advice to you is don't get too far ahead of your competitors. There's this great desire on, and you can, I'm not saying it's wrong to do so, on philosophical and environmental commitment grounds, by all means go much further ahead. But in terms of pragmatic business sense, then it's important to understand what your competitors are doing. So not just what the government's doing, but where are your competitors, those who sell similar products or offer similar services? Where are they journey are they committed to? Do you want to be the same as those so you don't have a disadvantage? Do you want to be slightly ahead because you see it as giving you opportunity and more business? It's best not to lag behind. And then, of course, your financiers are looking on, and if you're a listed company, that's shareholders as well. But if you're a small company, then if you want to borrow capital, your banks are looking on, and as well. So understand the environment and the drivers, and that's why we started with those, and we've talked about those a bit to begin with. Then you don't know how to get to where you're going until you know where you are. So that's why we talked a lot about inventory, carbon inventory. Then we talked about accounting. So turning your inventory into actual dollar implications. And I even at SME level, I encourage you to do this. Think about what this means, and what the costs are going to be going forward. And we're already seeing the pass through of carbon costs into electricity, and that'll be a big one for you guys. So think about at some point, it might be better to not be on the grid and incur all those charges that they're going to pass on to you, that you may go for your own renewable energy system, which at the beginning might cost you slightly more, but will hold your price so that for the rest of the life of that system, which can be up to 20 years, your price is fixed and you're not subject to increasing electricity carbon costs. And then if you go to an EV, then you'll need to scale your electricity the same, but then you're also buffered against costs on fuel and other things, which will also come through. And if you take your gas ovens or your diesel furnaces or whatever, and you take those across to electricity, then you're also buffered. So understanding what your costs are going forward helps you to note certain decision points, whether you should intervene and change the way you do things. And then benchmark, as I said, benchmark yourself against your competitors and those in your business to see where they are and where you have a disadvantage if you're not moving at the same rate of them, or you have an advantage, to get ahead and to either charge more for your product or get new customers to improve your outcome from that. And that benchmarking, but you can't benchmark until you know where you are. The other thing about this is, as I've said, and I'll talk about again for the marketing, is get your inventory, your carbon counting and your carbon accounting independently verified by somebody. Because if you're going to pass this information up your value chain, then they'll need it independently verified, but just to make sure that it's right and that you've got it right. And if you'll have to report to your bank, either to someone, either banks or whoever, mandatory or not, then they want it independently verified. So keep in mind that there will be costs for that. And the other thing is, at the end of as part of this claim, if you make a claim that you're going net zero on a net zero pathway, or you're going carbon neutral, that you have to have that independently verified. But as part of that, you need to have your inventory and your accounting verified as well. So if you commit to a target, you have to have that verified, that process of getting to some decarbonisation place, or carbon neutral, independently verified. And as part of that, they will independently verify your inventory, and that you'll need to do this regularly. It's not a one-off at the start to show that you're actually making the progress you've claimed. Every time for big business, that's every year. For SMEs, it can be every 2 or 3 years. You have to have your inventory verified, and that verifier may then go also back through your previous ones. Because if you said you reduced by 30% compared to whenever, and that you're going to do it at a certain rate, then you'll need that rate at which you're doing it independently verified as well. So keep that in mind as you embark on this journey. So knowing where you are, knowing where everybody else is going and benchmarked against them, then you set a target and decide whether you're going to go carbon neutral, whether you're going net zero, on what time frame, whether you're going net zero on scope 1 and 2 by when, and whether you're going net zero on scope 3 by when, if you're going carbon neutral on scope 1 and 2 only, or carbon neutral on scope 1, 2 and 3, and by when. So you need to think through that quite carefully for a number of reasons. One is that if you actually declare that and use it to market your product and you're trying to get ahead and get a position, which is why most of you should be doing it, as a business, as a person, and as as a business owner, that might be a philosophical commitment, and that's fine. I'm a climate change and decarbonisation zealot as well. I just happen to have a pragmatic view to it, and that's fine. But understand that if you're going to use it while you're doing it, which is for marketing or to give you an advantage, then you'll have to declare that. And if you can't meet it, then that becomes a problem for you. But what's more, as you declare it, you have to show all the underlying strategy at a certain level to convince people you can actually do it. And so you don't want to set a target that's not realistic either financially or in fact scientifically. And that's why we have the science-based target initiative pathways and sectoral pathways to help us to see what's actually physically and scientifically practical, but also economically practical. So set your strategy carefully. Some companies are splitting off the net zero and saying we're going net zero on scope 1 and 2 by X, by short term. And then they're saying we'll do scope 3 on longer term, usually by 2050. The other thing to understand is whilst we have a global pathway that certain sectors are expected to, their net zero pathway is faster than other sectors and other companies. And so if you're in the electricity sector, which most of you probably aren't, but for our utilities, everybody expects them to be completely net zero in scope 1 and 2 at least by 2035, because that's what the science says. But there are other sectors like the aviation sector and various others, cement sector, who can't do it that fast. And so they've got more time to do it. So be aware that it's not just that kind of graph I showed you and the global pathway, but it's actually sectorally specific. So look at your particular sector. If you're just a service business, which has an office and a car, then you can go much faster. And it would be expected of you that you could go by 2035, because if you get renewable energy and you turn your electric vehicle to EV, and you turn off your gas stove and you use microwave or you use an induction stove, then you can pretty much go net zero much faster, scope 1 and 2, and people would expect that. Scope 3 will be different. So decide whether you're going to commit to scope, what you're going to do with scope 1 and 2 on a time frame, and then talk about your scope 3 as a different target. But you can't claim ultimately to be truly net zero until your scope 1, 2, and 3 have been reduced by at least 90% compared to your baseline year, and you're only offsetting 10% or more. Does it make sense? This is really important. There's a lot of confusion around this, and you might need to explain this to your customers as well. So having set your targets, the next step you need to do is to put in place reduction options. And I basically had them under 4 headings. Reduce, so end user demand. Reduction in efficiency. Reduce how much electricity you use, reduce how much energy you use, reduce how many goods you use, how many inputs you use, particularly electricity for most of you, and fuel for cars or fuel for heating or cooking or whatever. So that's why the government already has support for that, but they're going to put a lot of money into tools and frameworks helping you to understand how to do that, to reduce first, because the cheapest energy and the least emitting energy is the energy you don't use. So look at how you can reduce your emissions first. Then for the things you still have to do, move to energy efficient processes, modify your process so that you actually are more efficient, so that the equipment you use and the things that you use are more efficient, and therefore use less electricity and goods as well. Then for what energy remains, or what inputs remain, and not just energy, but inputs into your process of other types, chemicals or other goods, replace them with low carbon or zero carbon options, so particularly electricity. And you can either rely on the grid to do that, which is going to decarbonise. So the government tells us by 2030, by at a certain rate, or you can switch to renewables. You're installing your own renewables. If you're in a building which you don't control, there's a whole discussion then with your landlord as to how you do that. If you can't do that, then you should buy a green electricity from one of the schemes that are offered by your utility to overcome that. But this is a signal to those of you who are landlords that your tenants are going to want to be able to increase their renewable energy amount, and they might want to put it onto your building, and you need to understand what that means for you. So replace high fossil fuel, high emitting fuels with low emitting fuels, and also inputs. And that's where you start to look down your supply chain and see where you can get lower carbon inputs. If you can't do that, then you should seek to remove. This is hard for SMEs because there's no way you can really capture and store this carbon. But it does provide an opportunity for people to start up businesses which can do carbon removal. And so consequently, particularly agricultural sector, there's a great opportunity in the agricultural sector. There's increasing opportunity in manufacturing and other areas as well. For example, putting CO2 into concrete if you're a concrete products person. So we want to try and remove it if we can. Depends on your business. It's very difficult for a lot of SMEs to do this, particularly in the city and in the country, but it also opens up a lot of opportunities for people who get into that space very quickly. And the last one is that when you can't do all of that, then you offset, or what I call reconcile, which is where you buy offsets from the offset market. If you want to show, if you can't physically yet meet your sectoral pathway until you get onto that, but also if you want to show you want to go carbon neutral. The important thing about this is the whole reason you're doing it is to be able to communicate to people that you're doing this because that gives you advantage or it stops your risk. So you need to have ongoing monitoring and reporting. As I said, for SMEs, you probably really only need to report every, to actually publicly report every couple of years to show you're on the pathway, but you should monitor every year to see that you're on the pathway, where you need to do more work, whether you've got ahead or behind. So you should have your inventory running and your carbon counting and accounting running, in fact, probably quarterly, just like your tax. But you'll need to report, you should report at least every couple of years and have it independently verified. And the key thing in all of this is reap the benefits, optimize your advantage, get government funding to help you with the transition, find new markets, hold your market with your current product, look for new products, look for new services, look for new opportunities, new products and services to support this rapid transition. Look for those. How can I find something I can do which is not yet well covered? That gives me an advantage. And then the last thing about this, and then I'll stop for any questions, is this is not a set and run exercise. As you can see, the whole environment's changing very rapidly. You really need to update this every year or two. I used to say to people, update it every 5 years, but even that's too slow now. Everything's moving so fast that you probably need to go through this cycle every couple of years. In your case, if you're an SME, if you're a big corporation, you need to do it every year. So that's why it's a circular process. Go back into this, what's happening in the environment. As we saw last week, the environment post 2030 changed again in Australia. It will certainly change post 2030 when the world realizes it's not moving fast enough. So hopefully this helps you. You just follow this through step by step to get all these in place. And then you can articulate this at a certain level. You don't need to give away all of your secrets, but at a sufficient level when you communicate this to your stakeholders and your clients and your customers and your banks and whoever else, other reason for doing this, you can show them that you have a clear step-by-step process. You've gone through, you've covered all the key things that are required, and this is how you're going to do it to give them confidence that you can actually do it. This diagram will be in the slides when they come out. All right, I'll stop for questions in about 5 more minutes or so. I just want to talk about the Climate Active Carbon Neutral program. This is one that people talk about a lot. This was a federal government driven and federal government managed program to enable people to be able to businesses small and large, to be able to show that their product or their business, and there's a difference between those two. You can be a carbon neutral business, but your products aren't carbon neutral. And you can be have a carbon neutral product, but you don't necessarily have a carbon neutral company because you've focused on just that product. And this was a question we had last week, I think, from Joe. Thanks very much, Joe. You could just be carbon neutral on a product or a service, but not the whole company. You can be carbon neutral on the company, in other words, what you do, but the product itself is not carbon neutral because it's got embodied carbon and other things in it from your scope 3s. So you can get, under the scheme, you can get carbon neutral for all sorts of things, and I'll show you those in a minute. You can get carbon neutral for product, you can get carbon neutral for company, you can get carbon neutral for events, you get carbon neutral for precincts. There's a whole bunch of things you can be carbon neutral on, and you can get a government endorsed badge which says it's carbon neutral that you're allowed to use to show that. And whether it's corporate or whether it's a product. So this program allows the Australian organisations, large and small, who produce products to be certified under the standard, the Climate Active standard, as carbon neutral. As I said, that's a choice you make if you want to show you're ahead of everybody else, not just on the expected net zero path, then you would do this to give you an advantage. It's awarded to businesses that have credibly reached the state of carbon neutrality, where the net emissions associated with the organisation or the product are accounted for and balanced through emissions reduction measures and the acquisition and cancellation of carbon offsets that meet stringent criteria. And so you can get that little Climate Active badge. The steps are there on the right. You count your emissions, you reduce those emissions, you offset remaining emissions, and then you're in a state of carbon neutral. And you have no net negative impact on the climate. As I said, the Climate Active itself, the carbon neutral itself, is becoming slightly outdated in the Climate Active program at the moment because it hasn't quite as rigorously enforced and kept the standards about reducing first and then offsetting. Its reputation is a little bit tarnished at the moment. Whether the government goes ahead and changes that and fixes that will determine whether it's useful to do this going forward. In Decarbonology, we have clients who are still doing this. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying if you do it, you need to put in place evidence to show that you're not just offsetting more than you should, but that you've undergone a significant reduction exercise in line with the sectoral emissions reduction pathways, and that you are then also buying additional offsets, preferably removals offsets, not reductions offsets, to meet your carbon neutrality. So I guess what I'm saying is you need to go a little bit beyond what the requirements are currently under Climate Active to provide confidence in your carbon neutral status. As I said, there are a whole bunch of different things you can get certification for your organisation, for your farm or your business, for products. So you can get it for your business, but then because your products have embodied carbon in them, that's a whole life cycle assessment. So your products may not be carbon neutral. And by the way, when you talk about carbon neutral, you need to say whether it's corporate, whether it's your company itself, or it's a product or whatever it is. Just don't say we're carbon neutral and expect, because people can become confused whether it's the product or it's the company and what that means. So you need to be very clear when you go for your certification, whether it's for the company itself, which may not cover the products, or whether it's a product or products which may not cover the company. If it's all of your products, then it will cover the company as well. But if it's not all of your products, if it's some of them, it doesn't necessarily cover the company. For services, of course, a lot of you and a lot of SMEs are service people. And so you can do it for services. Again, that's a life cycle emissions calculation, whereas the organisation one is an inventory one. Products and services are life cycle assessments. Events, you can just do it for individual events. And this is good for local governments or for NGOs. Can have just your event done. Buildings, and this is going to become really important for landlords and those who are in the property management and property development business, and even precincts now. So when builders bring out new precincts, they'll be able to have them certified as climate active, carbon neutral. So think about which bit you want for your carbon neutrality, your climate active, and then how you go about it will be different to get that certification. I won't go into the details of it, but it's still there. Keep in mind there is also a standard now, an ISO standard for carbon neutral, and you could follow that as well, but you'd have to get independent verification, and it wouldn't carry the little carbon neutral badge, a climate active badge, sorry. Just very quickly, we've been over this before. We've talked about net zero. There are the science-based targets initiatives standard, which helps you to say, this is the pathway we should be on, and to claim that you're on a net zero pathway, and then to reach net zero. This is the leading standard in this space. And you can register for them at any time, at any size. And so long as you keep meeting your commitments, you can say that you are on a net zero SBTI net zero pathway. Again, you'll need to have that independently verified and assured every couple of years. But my personal view is this is the minimum that you should do. If you're going to commit to some kind of public-facing decarbonisation pathway and strategy, then this is the one you should use. And then additionally, if you want to show you're ahead of everybody else even further, or for your own benefit, your own philosophical viewpoint, you want to go carbon neutral, then you should add carbon neutrality to your strategy as well. I won't go into the details of it. We talked about it before this, and there's this time, but just understand that there are quite rigid requirements for this one. That means you must cut first, at least to your sectoral pathway, and that pathway is different, as I said, for different sectors, depending on what you're in, whether you're in agriculture, food, energy, services, whatever. And that it actually means in its true form, scope 1, 2, and 3. And so you should, you can't claim you're actually net zero until you've done scopes 1, 2, and 3. But some people pragmatically are taking a kind of split view. So they'll say we're going to be scope net zero on scope 1 and 2 by this, and then we're going to be net zero on scope 3 by 2050 or 2030 or whatever. And again, it depends on your inputs. If you're a service organization, which is largely based around electricity, knowledge services, or advice, which is usually buildings, some paper, even less of that, and really just vehicles and running around and flying and things, then you would be expected that your scope 3 emissions, which are transport and electricity, will decarbonize quite fast. And so your net zero, scope 1, 2, and scope 3, should be much sooner than 2050. But for most of us, most companies are setting net zero emissions by 2030 or 2035 or whenever, according to their sectoral pathway, and then true net zero for scope 1, 2, and 3 by 2050. But the expectation is even then that you must be in consultation with 67% of your scope 3s by when you set your short-term target, which is either 2030 or 2035. So even then, you must have counted your scope 3 emissions, and you must be in discussions with your supply chain for them to give you the information and to give decarbonisation strategies for 67% of your scope 3. And this is, again, talks about the fact that other companies who are on this pathway and need to be, in terms of their financial reporting, they will want from you, if you trigger that 67%, they'll be on you now to provide information and have a pathway. If not, you might have a bit longer. So keep that in mind. So you set near-term targets and long-term targets, and that's the difference on this. Those targets should be in line with the science. As I said, you can't claim till targets are met, and there's the option to go beyond the value chain. So I'll come back to these ones in a minute. So are there any questions at this stage? I'll stop here. Does anybody have any questions about what I've been through? I've been through quite a lot. And there's even an updated environment. Any questions about that strategy and the steps in that strategy and the difference between net zero and carbon neutral and which you should choose? No? How are we going? Are we still out there? Is anybody out there?
Chris, I'm not sure if you can see the chat, but there are a couple of people responding there. So no questions, just taking it all in. Not yet.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, yep. That's because I'd put the participants over the top of the chat. Participants list over the top of the chat. So, okay. Very good. Okay, that's very good. You're a good audience because a lot of people have questions at this point, and the notes will be there. Do you have any questions for me about this process? I've kind of glossed over it fairly quickly, and I've not gone into much detail about how you do it.
Just got another comment just saying I don't have any questions, but appreciate learning the difference between net zero pathways and carbon neutrality.
Ah, good. Thank you. You know, that's true. And there's a lot of confusion about this, which will become, this will tighten up very quickly. But it's important to understand the difference and that the new world is the net zero. So if you want to be ahead, that's what you need to do. And it's less simple than it sounds.
I do have a question here, Chris.
Yep.
Who are the suppliers for verification?
Okay. It depends on the standard, and this is what you need to think about. If you're going for carbon neutral, it depends whether we're talking inventory or we're talking the actual strategy itself. So you're carbon neutral or net zero. If you're talking about climate active, then there's a list of verifiers for climate active, and you must use one of those verifiers to do your verification. If you're doing your carbon neutral if you're doing either your inventory or carbon neutral against the ISO standards, then it needs to be somebody who's an accredited verifier against that standard. So they will say we are an ISO 14067 or 40046 certified verifier. The main thing is that there are actually the different standards set the rules for who can be a verifier, and you need to reach out to them. So you need to check the rules under whichever standard you're working under. If it's greenhouse gas protocol, then they also have guidelines as to who can verify. I'm not giving you the answer as to actually people, but this is what to watch out for. Because again, in the end, if you're providing this to a bank or you're providing it to somebody higher up, they need to have confidence in the verifier as well. So there are verification standards, and particularly around ISO inventory, there's a whole standard on who can verify and who can't. Certainly the big financial companies all have certified verifiers. So the Deloitte's, but that's going to be very expensive for you. There are some niche verifiers who have the appropriate verification training and the appropriate verification certification from the particular standard. If you're looking at life cycle verification, then if they're a member of the what's called ALCAS, the Australian Life Cycle Association, if they're certified by them, then they're certified to do your standard. If you are going for climate active certification, then there are certified verifiers for inventory and by default inventory and for carbon neutral on their list. But it's important that when you're reaching out to the person to get their verification, that they can provide you with the evidence that they as to their ability to certify. Does that make sense? I haven't answered the question very clearly. And the problem is that it's for SMEs, it's quite difficult to find them. Because to go through that process to get that certification is expensive for them, and they pass those costs on to you. Does that make sense? So it's certainly the big financial accounting companies have set verifiers. There are a number of smaller niche companies who also have the appropriate verification. If they're on the climate active list, even if you're just looking for inventory, then most of those would be seen as being reliable for inventory, and you're probably going to get much better prices from those. But this is going to be something the government needs to provide some advice on, and will probably have to provide incentive and support for suitable verifiers to undertake verification at a price that's reasonable for you. And this is why you don't do it every year, you do it every couple of years. I can't really say this, but yeah, obviously that there are companies, we can do this, but we're not the only ones. And I'm not saying you should use us. I'm just saying that Decarbonology can do this, can do verification as well. But you need to ask your verifier who can do it. But for SMEs, it's quite difficult to find them. It's a long answer, and I'd like to give a simple one and give you a list of names. The list I will give you is the Climate Active. Go to Climate Active and look at their list. I'm not saying you have to use them, and they can do both the carbon neutral and the inventory. But also, if you're looking for someone who puts these services up, my main point is to ask them to prove or to demonstrate their credentials against the verification requirements for the particular either inventory standard or otherwise that mean they can do it. Does that make sense?
Made good sense to me. Thanks, Chris. At the moment, there's nothing else coming through on the chat.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, keep in mind that the verification costs can be quite high. The bigger you are, obviously, the more expensive they are. And so it's just important to control that process, not do it too often, but not to leave too much time between doing it, and shop around to find someone who's reliable and has the relevant credentials, but doesn't charge too much. But be aware that it will cost you a reasonable amount. Even the kind of cheapest small business inventory you can get at the moment is about 10 grand for verification. Let's see, here you go. That's verification of inventory, and then subsequent for the strategy again, because there's a lot of work. You go through all the calculations, you got to go through all the steps, make sure that everything's met. Very good. Okay. So let's move on then to the rest of the practical parts of decarbonisation strategy, and also we'll look at communication. Let's talk about renewable energy certificates and carbon credits. There's a lot of confusion in this space, and there are some hidden traps here for young players, which people don't understand. There's basically three types of offsets, because renewable energy certificates are really an offset. Okay, they're basically, you're either generating an offset because you're using renewable energy compared to the grid, and someone else buys that to offset their electricity emissions. There are ACCUs, which are Australian carbon credits, which enable you to buy them and to nullify 1 tonne of your emissions by those. And then there are international carbon credits as well, which you can use, which achieve the same purpose. And it's really important to understand in your strategy which ones you can and can't use, and which ones you shouldn't use, and which ones are reliable and which ones aren't, because your verifier will pick it up, and if you've made a mistake, it's too late. But also, there's been a lot of discussion recently around the reliability and the actual truthfulness and therefore trustability of even carbon credits under the ACCU system, and in some cases international systems. So the currency which you're using to offset your emissions you can't reduce is also important to understand and to know that's reliable. So let's start with STCs and LGCs. STCs are the small scale ones, whereas if you buy a renewable energy system and a number of people are going to do that, or you upgrade it, then you get a one-off shot of emissions reductions compared to the grid for that renewable energy system, assuming it runs its whole lifetime, and that it will reduce, and that those emissions are given to you up front when you install the system. There's two ways that this works. Usually the installer or the person who provides that system will give you a discount on the system, and they get to keep those STCs. So they have to take those STCs. They have to generate the STCs from the details on your system. They have to apply for those STCs to get those STCs, and then they have to sell them. So most people go for the easy option and say, okay, I will take a discount of X on my system, and I will give the supplier the system supplier those STCs. You can do that yourself. You can install the system, tell the supplier they're not going to have the STCs, they will charge you more for the system. Then you can register those STCs and you can sell them yourself if you think you'll get a better price. So therefore, systems below 100 kilowatts. So if you install an electricity system, a renewable energy system below 100 kilowatts, then it's subject to STCs and you get those up front. The difference here is that all of those are shoveled up front and are given to you at the moment you install it, and you don't have to worry about it after that. If you're above 100 kilowatts and you've got a 150 or a 200 kilowatt, then you have to generate your large scale certificates each year, depending on how much you actually generate. All right. The STCs are an estimated amount for the lifetime of the system in a typical location like yours, and they give out. But for the LGCs, you have to generate them every year, and you have to then apply for them every year, and you sell them on the LGC market each year. So a couple of things about these is that if you put a renewable energy system in, you can generate those STCs and sell them to get income. You can get a discount on your system up front when you put it in. But the thing to understand about that is that, firstly, STCs will only be able to be generated if you're an LGC generator, or in fact on small scale systems until 2030. After 2030, there'll be no more STCs and no more LGCs. So no more discounts for STCs on the system after 2030. And if you're putting in your big renewable energy system now, the income you could get from that comes from the STCs, not just the electricity, will cease after 2030. You cannot generate any more LGCs or STCs after 2030. So that's the first thing to keep in mind when you do this. So if you're going to do it, get in quick in the next few years to do that. But the sleeper in this is that if you install, say you're wanting to go carbon neutral or net zero to say reduce your electricity emissions as a small SME, and you've got your own facility, if you put the renewable energy system on and you give those STCs to the supplier for a discount on your system, you are no longer emissions reduced electricity, right? So even though you've put the renewable energy system on the roof and you're using electricity from that system, because you've sold the offsets or the STCs to somebody else, they've claimed the carbon reduction. You have to count your electricity at grid rates and the emissions from that electricity at grid rates, because the magic potion that makes it zero emissions is actually somebody else has used that. They've paid you for the right to claim those carbon reductions from your renewable energy system. And this is what catches a lot of people in small business. So if you've already installed a system on your business and you've given the STCs to your supplier, I'm sorry to tell you, but you must count your electricity from your system at normal grid emission rates, not zero. And this is to watch out for when you then, as part of your strategy, you install a renewable energy system. If you want to install the renewable energy system because it's cheaper, gives you cheaper electricity, it gives you more stability, then fine, go ahead. You should do it for those grounds anyway, and that's often the case now. But if you want to also do it to claim emissions reduction on your electricity, then you need to make sure you pay a higher price for the system and you keep your STCs. Does that make sense? And this is one of the things that trips a lot of people up in small business and who put small systems on. They just say yes to the supplier, I'll take the discount, put the system in, but you yourself can't claim emissions-free electricity from that system because somebody else buys the right to use that much electricity as net zero electricity. So that's the first thing to keep in mind about this. And whether you sell if you sell LGCs, it's the same. If you sell LGCs, then and you use if you generate electricity and you use it yourself and you sell the LGCs, then you can't claim that your electricity is zero emissions because somebody else has bought that right. Does that make sense? It sounds a little bit strange, but it basically means there's no double dipping. And so if you sell your right for zero electricity, you can't claim that right then because somebody else has bought it. So keep that in mind when you're doing this. So it may be better, in fact, that you just you pay extra from your retailer to get their green electricity because that's guaranteed to be zero emissions electricity rather than put your own renewable system in. The problem you have then is that the price will continue to change and go up because they're going to flow on the prices to you. So you need to put this into your calculations. The other thing is you can only use STCs or against electricity reductions. You can't use it to offset gas or diesel or liquid fuel emissions. You can only buy STCs to offset your electricity emissions. If you can't go renewable, you could buy STCs to offset your electricity, but you can only apply those to electricity. You can't apply them to gas emissions or to liquid fuel emissions or other emissions. So what you can do in that case is that you buy what are called carbon offsets like ACCUs, which is the Australian system, and these give you the right to emit 1 tonne of CO2, and then if you buy that offset, it means that you can nullify it. It's basically a potion which removes the emissions from that emissions that you've made and it nets it out. The person who sold that to you, though, can't then also claim that reduction. So you can only ever have the claim done once. So if you are generating offsets and you sell them, you can't claim the benefits from those. Keep that in mind as well. So if you do some kind of reduction process or you do some kind of sequestration process and you sell those offsets, you can't claim the zeroness of that process, and you have to do it at the normal rate. And if you're buying them, so you need to keep that in mind. But when you're buying them, if you buy an offset, that gives you the right to reduce by 1 tonne the amount for each of those offsets. In other words, you've nullified it. So you've still emitted, but because you paid someone else to reduce and not do it, or to sequester away, you've neutralized it. So you can use carbon offsets against any part of your inventory. So against your electricity emissions, against your liquid fuels, against any emissions that you have, you can buy an offset under the ACCU system from the Australian market to do that. At the moment, the price is about between $35 and $37 a tonne on the spot market. Because you're small, you can only buy from the stock market. The other thing to understand, it's very difficult to buy only a few. It's very hard for SMEs and small businesses to buy just a few carbon offsets at a time. And so what you need to go is to have someone who's an aggregator who buys pools of them from the big players or from the market, and they can then sell you smaller ones, smaller packages of offsets. But be aware you can't just go to the spot market and buy a small amount of offsets. And that can be difficult as well. And then the other thing about carbon offsets is their reliability. And there's been a lot of doubt about some of the types of offsets. There are lots of different types of offsets that you can buy. Some of them are reduction offsets where people have reduced their emissions in their processes, but not actually removed carbon from the air. And then there are removals offsets, which are ones where people have actually taken carbon out of the air, tree planting, for example, or direct carbon capture are examples, or there's a process called pyrolysis and biochar, which is another way of sequestering carbon underground. So then they tend to be worth more because they're more valuable. They also tend to be more expensive. So it's really important that in your strategy, you understand which are the defendable, reliable, legitimate offsets, just the same as if you're buying any other product. There are some which are legitimate and some which are knockoffs and some which are good and some which are not. So it's important to understand that usually the cheaper they are, the less reliable they are. It's not always true. And so expect to understand that you might need to pay slightly more for reliable ones. There's been a lot of discussion around the ACCU market about the methods to generate some of those. And so you need to just be careful just buying any ACCU. You need to work through with the provider to understand whether they how reliable it is. The other thing is that different types of offsets are worth more or less. And some of them have additional benefits. So you might want to buy a more expensive one because it has other sustainability benefits that align with your company and not just the carbon. But that needs to be certified as well. So so you can buy them from the Australian market. There's also a whole bunch of international offset markets where offsets are generated internationally. You should again buy from reliable international markets. So there are ones like Vera, Gold Standard, Puro Earth. There are a number of high reputation international markets, but you also still, even on those markets, need to look at what type of offset it is. You can buy very cheap offsets, Pakistani-based offsets. They're quite cheap, but you need to be careful how reliable they are and whether they're actually legitimate, and also the look. You need to think about whether buying an offset from Pakistan is a good look to your customers when you should be buying offsets from closer to home, whether you should be buying Australian offsets. So think about the view of your offsets that you use to your customer. It might be cheap to buy some from internationally and from certain parts of the market, certain parts of the world, or certain types, but your customers or your shareholders or your stakeholders might see that as a cop-out, that you're just doing it on the cheap. The same as they see if you don't reduce and you just go straight to offsetting, that you're doing this on the cheap. So it's important to think that offsets are not all the same, and that you need to think just as carefully about which offsets you buy and why you buy them as you do about your strategy and buying any other product. I'm not full of doom and gloom. I'm simply saying that it's buyer beware. There are a number of standards, and there are a number of good standards, and there are a number of good offsets out there. Just by way of illumination rather than advertising, Decarbonology has its own plantation for generating offsets. We set out to do a carbon sequestration offsets project, which is up in Gingin and Chittering. We chose to go with the international Vera standard because it was more rigorous and more reliable than to go with the ACCU method in Australia, just by way of example. Because the international standards tend to be more rigorous than Australian ones, but there are also some good Australian standards. So the main thing I want to say is get some advice about which ones you should buy, and don't just buy any old offset. Whether it's international or Australian, again, depends on your view of reliability, depends on whether you can get the particular type that you want. Customers and people you're supplying to tend to like it if you buy at home, if you're helping Australia to decarbonise by buying offsets from Australian producers, but it's not necessarily guaranteed. You don't have to do it always. And if there are international ones that suit you better, then you should do that. The other thing which I'll just raise at this point is there's a big opportunity for offset generation coming. And as you saw, the federal government will provide money for that from 2030 onwards, and even before then. So there's an opportunity in this not just to be a carbon offset taker, but to be a carbon offset producer. And there's a whole bunch of different activities and methods for generating offsets. So think about whether you can do that as well. Or whether you can be an advisor to people who do that. So there's a lot of whole new services over here. So be careful with your offsets. Only use them after you've reduced, and then make sure that they are as reliable and as trusted as you can, and see if there are additional sustainability benefits on some of them, which means they're slightly more expensive normally, which means that you prefer to buy those. And all of this is driven by your customers or whoever your target market is. Does that make sense? So it's just, that's the other thing in this space to look at if you're going to offset, but also got the opportunity to generate offsets. If you're going to generate offsets, you can do it on the, as I said, the ACCU system. The ACCU system covers agricultural projects, energy efficiency projects, landfill waste, mining, oil and gas, transport, vegetation, plantings. There's a whole range of different methods you can use if you're looking to go into the generation business. My advice is if you're going to get those offsets accredited under the Australian ACCU system, the Australian Carbon Credit Union system, that you also, during that process, make sure they align with equivalent international standards in that process, so that you can legitimately say, if someone buys that it's international standard, because not all ACCU methods meet international standards, even though they're government backed and government supplied. So if you want advice around that, there are people who can advise you about that, about how to go through that process and to generate those offsets yourself. But more likely as an SME, it's just around which ones you buy. But the indications are that, for example, that the offset price is going to go from about $35 on the spot market, where it is now, by 2030 to $100 a tonne. So keep that in mind also, that if you're relying on offsets for your strategy, the price of those is going to go up, because there'll be a shortage at 2030, trust me, because everybody won't have met their targets and they want to buy them. But that's a risk for you, but it's an opportunity. And by 2050, it's expected that offsets would be at around about, depending on who you talk to, between $200 and $400 a tonne for those offsets. So the price of those is going to go up. The price of removals offsets is going to go up much faster and hold its value than removals offsets. And by 2050, there are no removals then reductions offsets. By 2050, nobody's emitting anyway. So there are no more reductions offsets by 2050, and it's only removals ones which will be valuable at that point, but that's a long way off. So keep that in mind. But if you're going to go for true net zero, then you need to buy removals ones anyway. All right. So that's supposed to be a break. So that's about your strategy and the different elements of that strategy. The reason you have a strategy is that you're trying to project to the rest of the world. Apart from your philosophical view, you might just do it purely for philosophical view, and you don't care what you're doing it for the sake of the planet, and that's really good. That's a good motivator to have. But a lot of SMEs and most businesses are doing it because they see some kind of advantage either to remove risk or to seize an opportunity, which means that to do that, you need to actually communicate and publicize your journey, your net zero, your decarbonisation pathway, your decarbonisation targets, whether you're net zero, whether you're carbon neutral. So the whole purpose is to publicize that in the public domain to your clients and to the banks and whoever else. In that process, there are strict rules and strict requirements for you to do that so that you don't do what's called greenwashing, which means you say something, but you're not actually doing it. And so before you commit to a target and before you communicate a target, it's really important to understand what you can and can't say. So the ACCC, the Australian Consumer and Competition Community Commission has legal oversight over what people can and can't say about greenwashing, and we'll see they've got a standard and a set of principles for doing that for environmental, which covers greenhouse emissions. They can sue you, they can fine you, they can stop you from actually advertising, and ultimately, if you don't do the right thing, they can throw you in jail. So, and there's a big focus on this now because a lot of people have said that they are doing things and they're not. So it used to be the Wild West. It's tidying up very quickly. And so you'll see less of people making claims, unsubstantiated claims, because you can't. So if you're going to communicate it, you must show genuine action to reduce first, then use offsets, not just buy offsets. So this is why having a net zero declaration followed by a carbon neutral one is important, because the net zero one shows you're actually reducing at the best rate that is scientifically and economically feasible, and that you're then, if you're going to go for carbon neutral, offsetting additional ones. You must report publicly, and your reporting and publicity must enable evaluation and testing of those claims. So you can't just say, I'm on a net zero pathway, I'm meeting my targets, trust me. People won't do that. They need independent verification, but they need some clear indication of how you're doing it and that it's feasible. I'll talk about this a bit more in a minute. When needed, use authentic offsets with genuine additionality under reputable Australian or international standards. And as I said, offsets should have other sustainability benefits or address legacy impacts from your sector. If you want to have credible offsets and you do a credible carbon reduction strategy and you want to declare it publicly. So, as I said, this is covered by ACCC. There's a set of guidelines for businesses, and they're already starting to take a number of businesses, have previously, and are starting to take a number of businesses to court over the claims that they've made. It's actually illegal to make false or misleading claims under Australian consumer law. If you break that law and those rules, then the ACCC can investigate you and take some form of compliance or enforcement action. There are 8 principles that you need to comply with for trustworthy environmental sustainability claims. Okay, here's the link to the guidelines, which are on the right. And there's separate information from them about advertising and promoting sustainability claims. So I strongly encourage you to read these carefully if you're going to make your own claims. But if someone makes a claim and you're thinking of buying their product, you should also apply these to their claim when you do it. I'll go through this quickly, given the time that we have. Okay, so these are the 8. Make accurate and truthful claims. All claims should be true and accurate. So that applies both to your inventory, what you're emitting, but also any claims you've made that you've reduced that from previous years or that you've had offsets. And this is why I spend a lot of time talking about accuracy and reliability and credibility of inventories. The same thing applies to your strategy. All claims must be true and they must be accurate, and there are now all the standards around that, and that's why you must use the standards.
and on some regular interval, have it independently verified, because then you can show that that's true and accurate. You must have evidence to back up your claim. Ensure there's clear evidence to back all of your claims, and so that can be independent verification. It's also to provide further information. If you've bought offsets, which ones from where, what type of offset. Also, if you've made reductions, how you've made those reductions and how much those reductions are. So have evidence to back up your claim. You must provide access to this, to all the research evidence and data that you're relying on to make that claim. So it must be available on your website, or if they ring you up, you must be able to send them out a brochure which lays out in reasonable detail your strategy, your current emissions, your strategy, if you're claiming a reduction, how much you reduced against your previous one, the ways in which you've done that. It must be a sufficient level to convince them of the truthfulness of your claim. And this is what a lot of people don't understand. They've just made claims that we're going to do this by this, and they've not provided enough for this. And a little task for you after we finish this in the next week or so, go and see a few people who've made net zero or carbon neutral claims and see how much information they provided. If they've not provided enough information to convince you, who are now somewhat experts in how to do this, that it's true, then they've broken the consumer law. So you need to be aware that if you're going to go down this path, you will have to provide evidence, and not just evidence, but all of the research, the strategy, and independent verified inventories, and that you've met the reduction standard, all available quite clearly to your customers or anybody who wants to see. Whoever you have aimed that marketing at, they must be able to see it backed up in reasonable detail. Don't hide information. You must be transparent with information about your environmental impacts. All right, it's not just what you say, it's what you don't say. And under the law, not saying something is as bad as saying something that's wrong. Okay, if you're deliberately hiding information, or you've not said something that's relevant that you don't like, that's also a breach of the law. And if you do it inadvertently, you're still liable. So doing it deliberately, you're liable, but if you do it inadvertently, you're still liable. So that's why it's important to be accurate, and all of those things we talked about in inventory. And the same principles apply to reporting. So make sure you've not hidden anything. And if you're not meeting your target and you're making a genuine effort, then you just need to say so. This is our target. We've done the best we can. This is what we've done. We're not meeting our target. We will do more to meet the target, or we'll need to revise our target. People are actually more trust you more if you tell the truth than if you're actually meeting your target. If you can show that you've done a genuine effort and for whatever reason you haven't met it, then be transparent about that. Make it clear, but don't just say we haven't met it, bad luck, or don't say anymore. Say we haven't met it, this is why, this is how we're going to rectify that, or this is why we are revising our target. The latter you should try and avoid, because you should do all of this work beforehand to make sure you actually can realistically, on the balance of probability, meet that target before you declare it. So this is my other advice. Don't just declare some target and then try and work it out. Carefully work through your target, carefully work through how you're going to meet it, carefully through what it's going to cost you, and see that outweighs the benefit of doing it outweighs that, and then declare. If you can see that it's going to cost you too much or you can't do it, then it's best not to do it and not make a declaration, as strange as that sounds. Because if you're picked up and pulled up on it, that's much worse. Explain any conditions on your claims. You should check if there's any conditions they need to be met or steps that need to be taken for that claim to be true. So if you say I have a renewable energy system, we've installed a renewable energy system, then you need to make it clear whether you kept the STCs, whether you've actually retired the STCs and not sold them on, or you've sold those, in which case you can't make the claim. So you need to be quite clear about any conditions. And any conditions about your strategy. So if you say that our strategy is dependent on, a replacement on green hydrogen coming, so you just can't say we're going to use green hydrogen. You need to make it clear that you will only use green hydrogen when it's available, and this might change the timeline. So be very clear about any conditions on the claims. If they're only true in certain circumstances, you should explain those clearly to the customer and make it prominent. And I'll come back to the question about STCs in the question time. Thanks, Nicole. Avoid broad and unqualified claims. A business should ensure that it clearly claims any limitations should be clearly and prominently disclosed, and those more detailed claims shouldn't contradict the overarching claim. Just make a general statement saying we're going net zero by 2030. You must provide the detail of how you're going to do that and any qualifications around that detail and meeting that timeline and that target. You must use clear and to understand language. All right. Businesses should use clear and easy to understand language and avoid technical terms. Remember, these are your customers. They may not now be as knowledgeable as you about all of this, and just throwing forward our acronyms at them and saying, we've used ACCUs as offsets or whatever. Explain your claim and how you're going to get there clearly, easy to understand language, because these people are making this to make a choice about you. If there's a bit they don't understand, they're confused, they either won't trust you, or if you're trying to bamboozle them by technology and it turns out not to be true, and you think that won't matter because they don't know, eventually someone will find you out. So use clear, easy to understand language. Don't use visual elements that give the wrong impression. Businesses should avoid visual elements that can give the wrong impression. Okay, so there used to be this one, and some of you have probably seen it, solar free from the sun. All right, just had a little sun and it said solar free from the sun. That is not true. All right, once you install your renewable energy system, then you won't pay any electricity costs, but they're ongoing. But the system itself cost you money to do that, so it wasn't free. And then you got to replace inverters and have clean it and things. So don't put up some symbol or some picture or some statement, visual element that's not actually gives the wrong impression about the benefit of your product. If you say our product's better than theirs and you show yours small carbon and there's a big footprint, you need to be able to defend that and have all their data at the right level as well. You need to consider the overall impression that's created. Be direct and open about your transition. If it's not going, if business is going to transform to more sustainable operations and wants to tell about it, it should be direct and open. If you're having trouble in your transition and you set off with all good intent and there's been something that's happened that wasn't expected, then be honest and open about that. If your journey is not going well, be transparent and open about that. Transitioning to a more sustainable business model takes time. It's not a straight line. People understand that. Explain that as you go and be transparent and open about that transition as well. Be cautious about your goals. Not make claims unless there's legitimate plans in place to meet these goals and you can put those up and show people what they are. It's better to under-promise and over-deliver than the other way around. If you can't reduce your emissions in the short term, say so. Set a longer-term target. Okay, and that's why the science-based transition path is good. Okay, I won't go into governance. I'll put some in here about bigger businesses, what they do with governance. Here are some questions I'd like you to think about having been through the 3 days of the course, the 3 sessions of the course. These are some of the key messages for you to take away and think about before you go down this path to count your emissions and to go carbon neutral or net zero, which one you should do. Have a think about these, look back through the slides and look through all the information. And that'll help you in your strategy. Hopefully it's all become a bit clearer. Let me go to the questions. should the carbon calculation and battery, i.e. where both contribute to cost of system installation and where local government has no operational control of electricity consumption. Okay, sorry. Before that, from Nicole, should the carbon calculation include both exported electricity from the solar PV system or just consumed? All right. So when you're doing your calculation for the emissions from your electricity, it's your emissions, it's your inventory. So you only count how much electricity is consumed. If you consume 10,000 kilowatt hours in a year, you need to calculate for that 10,000 kilowatt hours that you consumed within the premises what the emissions are. If that's from the grid, then you multiply that 10,000 kilowatt hours by the grid emission factor. If it's from a renewable energy system that you've installed and you haven't sold the STCs, you've kept those and you've retired them yourself, then you can claim zero emissions and it's 10,000 kilowatt hours by zero. If you install a renewable energy system and you sell the STCs, then you need to multiply your 10,000 kilowatt hours by the grid factor. Does that make sense? So the answer is that you don't count what's exported unless it's above what you need. So if you are actually exporting renewable energy above what you need, then you can technically, and if you've kept the STCs, so it's your system, you've not sold any STCs, if you export electricity to the grid, then technically you can claim that exported renewable energy against your inventory. Right? Normally the way that that's done reliably is you turn those, for STCs, it doesn't matter because you've kept those for yourself. So you would normally, if you're a large producer, turn them into LGCs because it's a formal process to prove that you've exported that much. So if you're going to export, you need to have proof of that. And technically, if you've not sold the STCs and you don't sell LGCs for it, you can claim that as an offset against your own emissions, right? But it's a bit tricky. So the short answer to that question is you need to count your own consumption, not what's exported. And if you're going to export it, you need to try and turn it into some kind of if you're large enough, some kind of LGC. Otherwise, basically the grid is getting free zero emissions electricity from you when you send it to them. Did that answer the question? So when you're talking about your inventory, it's only what you've consumed. If you've got excess, then technically you can, and you've kept the LCC, you can claim that as an offset against your emissions. But keep in mind that you can only claim renewable energy offsets against electricity consumption. You can't claim that electricity that you exported against your diesel or against your solid fuel or gas. You can only claim it against electricity consumption. Do you have any examples of how local governments can work with community organisations that lease local government facilities to install rooftop solar batteries, i.e. where both contribute to cost of system installation and where local government has no operational control of electricity consumption? The answer is that I'm not aware of where that's being done at local government at this stage. I think it should be done. What I'm actually aware of is the reverse. There are local governments who have put renewable energy systems onto their facilities, and their tenants are asking those local governments to prove to them how much electricity is renewable and whether they've kept the STCs or the LGCs and the price of that renewable energy compared to grid when they charge them. So your customers may become more discerning. The local government customers in their facilities may become more discerning and want that information from local government. So that's one thing to keep in mind. There are a couple of examples where, for example, local governments have worked with bowling clubs or football clubs to install systems onto those, to install renewable energy systems onto those facilities. I don't know specific ones, but I'm aware of examples where that has been the case. But again, you need to document that very carefully. You need to have the proper negotiations, and then you'll need to have proper metering in place, and you'll need to have the appropriate pricing around that. Does that answer that question? You should. You say you don't have any control over the operational of the electricity consumption. That's true, but you should have metering. Everybody should meter their tenants now in local government, and you should have exact understanding of how much they're using. And those tenants also should be able to say to you how much of that power you've provided me is renewable electricity and what's the price of that compared to the grid. All right. Does that answer that question? If you do have metering, that's good. That's a start. And then you need to also be able to clearly declare to your tenants how much of that's from renewable energy, assuming you haven't sold the LGCs or the STCs. If you've sold those, then sorry, they've got grid electricity anyway. And then also any price difference that needs to be articulated to them as well. And a lot of tenants will ask you if they can install on your facility. If you're a building holder, you'll get more requests for that, and you need to have an answer to that. And if you won't, be prepared that they'll shift. But in that case, or they might ask you to do it, and then you need to have some arrangement in place. The main thing is have clear business contracts around all of this stuff. The query related to if we had sold the STCs, in that case, only count what is consumed on site based on the grid. Yep. So if you consume 10,000 kilowatt hours, as I said, you have to count your inventory that 10 kilowatt hours is based on the grid factor, not the renewable energy factor. But not what was exported. What's exported wasn't none of your business. But just for your own calculation. These are very good questions. All right. Just very quickly, before we go, because we're coming into time, thank you very much. For those of you who've enjoyed the training, or you think you need more training, with the kind permission to switch your thinking, I'd like to make this plug. At Murdoch, we're offering a postgraduate level micro-credential in strategic decarbonisation management, which teaches you all of the stuff I didn't have time to teach you. That's being offered in flexible delivery mode over 28 weeks, starting in mid-February in 2026. So long as you have an undergraduate degree of some sort, then you are able to take that. If you're interested, for that offering that's coming next year, the federal government's offering fee offset against the full fees, and so the cost of that 28-week course, which will teach you pretty much everything you need to know, will be about $2,400. So if you want to know where to find out about that, I put a link on it here for you. And we've had a number of students go through this, some of who are using it for their own purposes in their own jobs. Some of them have gone off to be consultants in this space. So that's there for those of you who are really interested and want more information and want to learn how to do this more effectively. Thank you very much. Thank you for hanging in there. Thank you for wanting to learn. Hopefully this has provided you with all the information that you need. And it's been great to be part of this.
Thanks, Chris, for sharing your very extensive knowledge. Very much appreciate your time over the last 3 weeks, and your generosity in providing all the additional context when the questions come through as well. Just for anyone who's listening, if you do have further questions following today, feel free to send them through at energy@switchyourthinking.com. We can pass them on to Chris, or he's got his contact details on the screen as well. Please, if you can fill out the survey, I can send out a link to that. There's a survey following your participation in this session. We'd really appreciate your feedback, and you could be in the running to win an energy audit as well. So just, yeah, thank you once again, and I'll just leave Chris to say goodbye and wrap up. Cheers.
Thank you. Good luck, everyone. Good luck in developing your strategies, thinking who it matters to. A lot of opportunity in this space. I actually think there's more opportunity than there is risk for people, but understand your risk. Think about the opportunities and think about how best to make the most of it. And if you're not sure, then reach out for professional advice if you can afford it, because that will help a lot. And just get everything verified in what you say. And good luck. It's an exciting new period for everybody.
Okay. Thanks all. I'll end the session now.
Thanks, and see everybody.
Okay, bye.